This is part one of two parts on hematopoiesis, or blood cell maturation. And specifically, we're going to do granulopoiesis in this first one, which is the granulocyte maturation, neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. So hematopoiesis in general is a production of blood cells, and it is ongoing constantly. We're always making new red, white blood cells and platelets, and in turn those cells are aging out and constantly dying. We keep this up as homeostasis, which is balance, equilibrium of whatever system it is we're talking about, and this includes the bone marrow and the red blood cell and white blood cell and platelet production as well. Here's a pictorial representation of hematopoiesis of both the granulocyte line up at the top that starts off with a common precursor, or basically a stem cell. Those divide out into myeloblasts or pro-erythroblasts, and then proceed to mature from there. So in the granulocyte line, we have the promyelocyte, myelocyte, metamyelocyte, band cell, and then finally the neutrophil for maturation in the granulocyte line. For the maturation in the rubrocyte line or erythrocyte line, we're going to go from a pro-erythroblast to an early erythroblast, an intermediate erythroblast, late erythroblast, and polychromatic erythrocyte. And these have different names in veterinary medicine. We start with a pro-erythroblast, which we will actually call a rubroblast. An early erythroblast will be a pro-rubrocyte, then a rubrocyte, then a meta-rubrocyte. And we'll go through that more specifically on the red blood cell maturation PowerPoint. This is a handout that I gave you guys in class that shows the different cell lines, all coming, or most of them, I should say, coming from this myeloid stem cell. That basically is the beginning of all of these cells, and it will differentiate depending on what types of signals it gets within the bone marrow. And it will differentiate either into a white blood cell line, starting with a myeloblast, or to the red blood cell line, starting with a rubroblast. And again, we go myeloblast to promyelocyte, and then myelocytes, and they can either be neutrophilic myelocytes, eosinophilic myelocytes, or basophilic myelocytes. And then we have metamyelocytes, which can be eosinophilic and basophilic as well, and then band cells, and then finally the mature segmented neutrophils, eosinophils or basophils. And we're going to focus mostly on neutrophils in this presentation, just because that's the most common cell that we're going to see, and so we'll have more likelihood of seeing promyelocytes, myelocytes, metamyelocytes in the neutrophil line than we do with eosinophils and basophils. We are going to touch on those from time to time. So again, the active bone marrow in the adult is that red bone marrow, and in this image of the human, all those areas that are lighting up in red is generally where the active bone marrow is going to be. So it's going to be at the end of the long bones, and then in the flat bones like the pelvis, the ribs, and the sternum. And then that slide there is just a representation of what you might see. There's still a lot of fat that's going to show up, so we still have lipocytes or adipocytes that are in this bone marrow sample, but you're going to have a lot of hematopoietic cells and megakaryocytes and things like that that are creating new red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And again, here's a representation. This is actually from your anatomy book With the yellow marrow, they're in the diaphysis of the bone, which is the shaft of the bone. The epiphysis on either ends is where the red bone marrow is going to be, and that's in the spongy bone or the cancellous bone. And then the cortical bone is going to protect the yellow marrow that's in the center. There can be areas outside of the bones that will help to produce new red blood cells and white blood cells as well. And these are called extramedullary because they're outside of the medulla of the bones. Liver and spleen are the primary source of hematopoiesis that is extramedullary. And especially in the fetus, this is before puppies and kittens and other mammals are born, the liver and the spleen are doing the primary hematopoiesis. Now, as that animal is born, that switches over into the red bone marrow, but that can vary as the animal is born, but it can also vary in the adult. If there's increased demand, like massive blood loss or a severe infection, the liver and the spleen can jump back into the hematopoiesis game and start to make more red blood cells and white blood cells. The thymus plays an important role in our young animals because this is where we have most of our lymphocyte production and maturation, especially of T lymphocytes. And this is obviously going to become less active in adult animals as that immune system matures and the T lymphocytes have basically learned the majority of what they need to learn by hanging out in the thymus. And then we also have lymph nodes. This is a big site of lymphocyte maturation in adult animals after the thymus has regressed somewhat. And this is not a production area of white blood cells, but it is a maturation area. This slide is a human, obviously, but I liked it because it shows us our lymphatic organs, which also correlate very nicely with our extramedullary hematopoietic organs, as well as showing an image of the bone marrow in the distal end of that child's femur, which is oddly shaped. But anyway, we have the thymus, which is, again, where we're going to get maturation of lymphocytes, especially T lymphocytes. We've got the lymph nodes, maturation of lymphocytes in the adults. The spleen, there's not an image of the liver. Well, there's an image of the liver, but it's not pointed out here. It's in the right cranial area of this child's abdomen. But spleen and liver, extramedullary hematopoiesis, and then finally our medullary hematopoiesis happening within the bone marrow. So we're going to talk about these cells step by step, but we're going to start with this most immature cell, which is called a blast cell. And I really like this slide because it has basically all of our players here on one slide. This is from bone marrow, but it's still really nice to see all these different types of cells. We can imagine that it might be from a blood smear. But generally our cells are going to start out really large and decrease in size as they mature. And then we have the blast cell, which unfortunately in this image is not the very most biggest cell of all of them, but you can see it's got a really big nucleus that's taking up a large amount of cytoplasm of the cell there. As these cells mature, the nucleus is going to start to decrease in size, and the chromatin is going to become more dense and clumped. In the larger cells and the more immature cells, the chromatin within the nucleus looks really kind of fine and granular instead of clumpy. And then as the nucleus is getting smaller, the amount of cytoplasm will seem to increase. So the nucleus is taking up less of the cell, so they'll look like there's more cytoplasm there than in the earlier stages. So again, looking at the same image, we see that blast cell, the nucleus is taking up pretty much, 3/4 of the cytoplasmic area of the cell. But when you go down into the promyelocyte and myelocyte, you can see there's a lot more cytoplasm as compared to the nucleus. And then when you get down into the metamyelocyte band and segmented neutrophil, a lot more cytoplasm there as compared to the nucleus. So leukopoiesis is the term we use for the production of leukocytes, or any white blood cells. And we're going to specifically talk about granulopoiesis, which is the production of our granulocytes. And again, that's neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. So this is the general maturation sequence of granulocytes. And so by the time we're done, I want you to feel really comfortable with identifying each of these cells individually, especially in a progression like this. It should be more straightforward when we see a progression. So let's talk a little bit about our granulocytes. When you see the term PMN on here, that means polymorphonucleus, and that means that the nucleus has multiple different shapes. So if you think about your neutrophils and your eosinophils and your basophils, the nucleus doesn't have a really predictable shape. It changes with the cell. So these PMNs, or let's just abbreviate that to neutrophils, are going to spend about 7 to 10 days in the bone marrow. And then they're going to migrate out into the peripheral blood and then just live for a couple of days. They can only migrate in one direction, from bone marrow to blood or into the tissue. They don't go back into the bloodstream after they've left. They don't go back into the bone marrow after they've left. There are two pools of neutrophils that are circulating. We have this circulating pool that's just kind of floating around in the bloodstream, and then we have a whole population of neutrophils that are adhered to the walls of the vessels, and they're on the margins, so we call that the marginal pool. In dogs, about 50% of the neutrophils are in the peripheral pool, just kind of circulating around, and then about 50% are in the marginal pool. In the feline, only about 30% of their neutrophils are circulating at one time, and 70% is in the marginal pool. So for that reason, cats look like they have a decreased percentage of neutrophils on the differential as compared to dogs. So, generally you'll see 70% or more in a canine blood smear of neutrophils. And in the felines, a lot of times you'll see closer to, 50, 60%, sometimes neutrophils and lymphocytes are much closer in percentage than they are in the cat. Than they are in the dog. The cool thing about this, though, is that cats can actually release those neutrophils from the marginal pool pretty quickly in times of stress or infection, and so you'll see cats have basically a spike in their neutrophil count, and they can very easily go from 50% neutrophils to 90% neutrophils, depending on what's going on within the cat's body. So that's kind of a cool thing. They can kind of release those really quickly and increase their circulating white blood cells. So this maturation is continuous. It's not like jump from cell type to cell type to cell type. They gradually change over that period of 7 to 10 days. And so a lot of times you'll see cells that are a little harder to identify because they're kind of in between stages. So you sort of round up. So you look at what other cells are surrounding it and, basically look at what company they keep. If there are other white blood cells that are immature, then we're probably looking at a myeloblast. If there are, closer to a lot of band-looking cells, then it's probably more likely to be a band, or closer to a metamyelocyte or something like that. So you kind of look at what else is circulating, what else is on your blood smear. If you just find one abnormal cell or one immature cell, it becomes a little bit harder to identify then. But usually you'll have several different cells to compare it to, and you'll make the best determination that you can. All right, so we're going to start with the earliest of the granulocyte immature cells, and that's called the myeloblast, and that's the very next stage after the stem cell. This is basically the starter cell for our granulocytes. They can't be distinguished from each other at this stage. We can't tell if it's going to be a neutrophil, an eosinophil, or a basophil at this stage, so don't worry about that at all. and we call this a myeloblast. And in the image on the left, you'll see a myeloblast, and then the basophilic cell to the left of it is a metaruberocyte, or a nucleated red blood cell. So that'll give you some idea of size comparison. This is a pretty large cell, and you can see the nucleus is taking up a majority of that that cytoplasmic size. The nucleus is taking up most of that cell. It's a very small amount of cytoplasm in comparison to nucleus size. Generally, we may have a couple of pale nucleoli. The chromatin pattern is going to be very fine and grainy, not really clumpy at all. And then that cytoplasm is generally going to be a dark blue in color. So the next cell after the myeloblast, we're going to call this a promyelocyte. Kind of the distinguishing characteristic of the promyelocyte is now we have granules. Now these granules, again, you're not able to distinguish the different types of granules. They're all going to stay in pretty dark purple at this point. So they look sort of basophilic. But the nucleus is going to be big and round. You're going to have dark purple or blue granules. And the nucleus is still going to take up a large portion of that cell. So that's how you characterize the promyelocyte. Large round nucleus and granules. Generally, your cytoplasm is going to be still staining pretty basophilic, pretty blue. Next is the myelocyte, and this is the first time that we might be able to identify these cells as they start to differentiate into neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And as you can see on this image, we have a couple of neutrophilic myelocytes next to an eosinophilic myelocyte. So these granules are starting to become more specific. The nucleus is still going to be fairly round, but very often you'll have like a little pale area to the side of the nucleus that starts to show up in some of these cells. Here's a basophilic myelocyte to compare to the eosinophilic and the neutrophilic one that we saw in the slide before. And again, you have this, relatively round nucleus with dark purple granules. So we're starting to see differentiation in these granules. Now, metamyelocytes are more likely to be seen, and now we're getting into the cells that you're going to be more likely to see more frequently in peripheral blood when you make a blood smear. So the metamyelocyte also becomes a lot easier to differentiate because now you have this kidney-shaped nucleus. And this is sort of a big clue because eventually this is going to turn into a band and then a segmented neutrophil. So you can imagine this, kind of pinching that's happening in the nucleus that will eventually lead to a band. Now, at this stage, you should be able to identify these cells as neutrophils, eosinophils, or basophilic metamyelocytes. So again, what you're going to be looking for is a kidney-shaped nucleus. Your amount of cytoplasm is going to be increasing as compared to the size of your nucleus. And you're going to identify granules. So this one here is a neutrophilic metamyelocyte. You can see those granules are kind of neutral in color, and that kidney-shaped nucleus. All right, here is another bone marrow smear that is showing a whole lot of stuff going on. So I'm going to bring your attention to the bottom right corner of the slide where we have the myeloblast. So here's a big round nucleus taking up most of the cell, deep purple cytoplasm. So that is our starter cell. And you can see that pale area in the nucleus. That in the nucleus is a nucleolus. If there are multiple, there would be nucleoli. And so that is our myeloblast. Next, I'm going to direct you to the center, closer to the center of the slide, where we see this big purple cell, big round nucleus. You can see a nucleolus in there, and then a bunch of purple staining granules. So that's our promyelocyte. So big round nucleus, granules, and a little bit more cytoplasm as compared to your nucleus size. All right, and then we have a myelocyte to the right of that promyelocyte. So there's our next stage. Nucleus is still pretty round, starting to get a little bit of an indent here. We do have granules that are identifiable as neutrophilic in this case, and still a fairly large amount of cytoplasm to nucleus at this point. And then we have two metamyelocytes with their indented nucleus, and I would point your attention to the one at the bottom of the screen, the neutrophilic metamyelocyte down there. We've got our kidney-shaped nucleus, and then we have, you can start to see that clumping in the nucleus is happening too, a couple of dark spots that we didn't really see very much before, a couple of really dark areas on the top of that nucleus. And then the granules here are neutrophilic. You know, it really starts to remind you of a neutrophil. That neutrophilic metamyelocyte kind of up at the top area there, top left, is starting to look like a band. You can see it's still, you know, it's got an indented nucleus, but that is really starting to look like a band there. So it's almost to band stage. Okay, so this is a really nice slide to kind of see a lot of the different types of cells all next to each other for comparison. So let's talk some more about these metamyelocytes. This is a great eosinophilic metamyelocyte. So you can see that indented nucleus is a little less kidney-shaped than the other one, but look at those granules. Beautiful, beautiful eosinophilic granules. You guys know those are my favorites. So this metamyelocyte is really beautiful, eosinophilic. And very, very rarely will you see a basophilic metamyelocyte, but you'll again see those dark purple granules that are classic for basophilic or basophilic anything, basophil anything. But the indented nucleus and the dark purple granules. The next step in the maturation are bands, and this is a picture here of a band on the left and a segmented neutrophil on the right. That nucleus is going to take more of a horseshoe shape. You're going to have a pretty good amount of cytoplasm that's kind of light, very light blue, neutral color. You don't want it too blue because then we start getting toxic areas, which we'll talk about later. Identification of bands can vary from pathologist to pathologist. Some people are really strict about any sort of pinching in the nucleus automatically disqualifies it from being a band and moves it into segmented neutrophil category. And I tend to be more in that camp, although I will, yeah, you know, it kind of depends on the cell. Sometimes you see it and you're like, it's a band. Even if it has like a little extra pinching that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see. But this image here is pretty clearly a band. And whenever I give you guys IDs to do, I'm going to try and make it very clear that they're bands versus segmented neutrophils. So here's a little review here. All the way on the left, we have a myelocyte. So we don't go all the way back here. Haven't gone back to myeloblast and promyelocyte here. So we're starting at the myelocyte stage. So we've got a round nucleus. We've got a pretty good amount of cytoplasm here. And, you know, it's starting to trend towards neutrophil from this image that I see. The metamyelocyte, you can see the nucleus starting to indent. We don't have that pale area right next to the nucleus that I like to see. I think that is helpful. But this one, you know, again, is neutral in its granules, so most likely a neutrophilic metamyelocyte. And then there's the band in the third image there, nice horseshoe shape. And then finally our segmented neutrophil, which you guys I know are very comfortable identifying at this point. Okay, and then from the myelocyte stage again, and that's the bottom right, there's our big round nucleus with a moderate amount of cytoplasm that is pretty neutrophilic, so I would call that a neutrophilic myelocyte. Then moving at the bottom left image is our indented nucleus, so there's our kidney bean shape, and that's a myelocyte. Excuse me, that is a neutrophilic metamyelocyte with that kidney bean nucleus. And then there's our band in the upper right, nice horseshoe shape, neutral granules. And then finally the mature neutrophil in the upper left. So our mature granulocytes, I think you guys feel pretty confident in identifying, but just, to recap, they're going to be the smallest cell. Eosinophils and basophils are going to be a little larger than neutrophils even when they're mature, but they're the smallest cell from the maturation standpoint. And the cytoplasm is very specific because you're going to have those granules that correlate with which type of cell they are. Generally, you need about 3 to 5 segments in the neutrophil nucleus. If we have less than 3 or more than 5, we'll cover that in our abnormals. And then the eosinophils, generally that nucleus is not going to be as tightly segmented. Sometimes it'll only have 2 parts, or maybe 3, but generally you're not going to see like 5 segments on an eosinophil nucleus. All right, so let's look through these again. So these are some other slides where we can identify some cells. So the slide on the left here is going to show some things. So the red arrow is pointing to a really nice looking eosinophilic metamyelocyte. So again, kidney-shaped nucleus, so that automatically is going to tell us that's a metamyelocyte. But then look at those granules. Really, really red, pinky red, orangey red almost granules. So that's an eosinophil through and through. And then we go to the yellow arrow, and that is a neutrophilic myelocyte. So how do I know that's a myelocyte? We look at the nucleus. So nucleus, big round nucleus. We have granules that are trending it towards a neutrophilic line as compared to the eosinophil that you can see below it. And you can see it's a really nice neutrophilic myelocyte. And then up at the top with the blue arrows, those are metarubricites or nucleated red blood cells. And we'll talk about those in the red blood cell PowerPoint, but just for size comparison, that's what we're dealing with there. Now the cell without the arrow it also looks like it's sort of been shattered and like maybe its granules are scattered everywhere. And that to me looks like it is probably a neutrophilic metamyelocyte. The nucleus isn't specifically kidney bean shaped, but it's definitely indented and pinched. And those granules look to me more neutrophilic than eosinophilic. So that's what I believe that cell is there. Again, you're not going to see these basophilic metamyelocytes, but this is cool because this one has it in this smear. And it's a kidney bean shaped nucleus with basophilic granules, and that's a big cell. You can see from its size next to the red blood cells, that's a pretty big cell, which makes it a metamyelocyte. All right, here's another picture. I'm going to direct you first to the black arrow towards the right side of the screen. And that is a myeloblast. So, okay, big round nucleus, really fine. It is not, I apologize. The blue arrow, not the black one, the blue arrow, I misspoke. Big round nucleus. The nucleus has very fine chromatin. You don't see any clumping in that, and just a small amount of cytoplasm around that cell. Then the promyelocyte is the black arrow, and that one is, you can start to see some granules developing. So we've got granules, we've got a round nucleus, but look at all that cytoplasm as compared to the myeloblast that the blue arrow is pointing to. And then the yellow arrow, we have that kidney bean-shaped nucleus, which makes it a metamyelocyte. And then it's trending more towards neutrophilic. This is a pretty basophilic slide overall, but that metamyelocyte there is trending more towards neutrophilic granules than, say, basophilic or eosinophilic. And then we have matured neutrophils there in green, and then a couple of metarubricites, nucleated red blood cells are along for the ride as well. So again, we've got that myeloblast in the center on the right side here, just a little bit of cytoplasm with that big round nucleus. And then the promyelocyte at the black arrow with granules and a larger amount of cytoplasm. That's how you tell those two apart. Okay, back to this slide again, just to kind of get reacquainted with some of the earlier stages. So we've got that blast cell on the right side of the screen, very small amount of basophilic cytoplasm and a big round nucleus that's very fine, not very clumpy or no real dark spots in there. And we move from the blast to the promyelocyte over on the left side. Another big round nucleus with an increasing amount of cytoplasm in that one. Then we move to our myelocyte, and now we start to get some good granules here in the myelocyte. Roundish nucleus. You can see that myelocyte nucleus is starting to think about indenting, and so it's getting ready to become a metamyelocyte. It's just not quite there yet. And this is what I was talking about earlier when I was saying, we don't specifically jump cell to cell to cell. There's a process, and it's a smooth transition from one cell to the next. So you might catch them in various phases along the row as they change from one type of cell to another and mature. But the myelocyte is characterized by starting to get those granules. Then the metamyelocyte above that, and again we have that indented nucleus, that kidney bean-shaped nucleus, and that is a neutrophilic metamyelocyte. You can see that the granules are not very eosinophilic or basophilic. They're right in the middle, kind of neutral. To the right of the metamyelocyte, we have the band, and that's a really nice looking band, horseshoe nucleus. You're starting to see some clumping. Do you see the clumping happening in the nucleus? Just the dark areas where that chromatin is starting to clump up together. You can see it a little bit in the metamyelocyte as well. And then finally on the left, the segmented neutrophil, and you can really see that nucleus starting to pinch and divide, and then also getting more clumping in the nucleus of the chromatin. Here we go, one last slide here of the myeloblast with the nucleoli. And again, those are those pale areas in the nucleus. Big round nucleus, relatively small amount of cytoplasm that is staining a deep blue. Letter B is the promyelocyte. We've got the dark granules. These are not differentiated yet, so they're just kind of dark purple granules within the cytoplasm in a big round nucleus. Letter C, we have the myelocyte, which this is starting to turn into a neutrophilic metamyelocyte, or excuse me, a neutrophilic myelocyte, and so our granules are going to start to lighten for this line. D, we have our kidney-shaped nucleus with that kind of pale area right at the indentation, and again, those granules are staying nice and light, so this is going to be a neutrophilic metamyelocyte. E, this is a band neutrophil that's starting to think about becoming a segmented neutrophil. On the right side of that band nucleus, you can see how it's kind of starting to pinch a little bit there. So this is one of those ones where Serena and I might disagree about whether it's a band or not. But this one I like calling it a band. And you can really see that chromatin starting to clump up into dark spots within the nucleus, which is kind of cool. And then finally, that segmented neutrophil, where it is splitting into multiple areas. You get really clumpy, dense chromatin and a lot more cytoplasm versus the size of the nucleus that we were seeing in earlier cells. Okay, so that's the end of granulocyte maturation. You can go step by step through the video again. It looks like it's been about 32 minutes, not too bad. So you can watch it anytime, or you can go through the PowerPoint. I will have it all uploaded for you to go through at your leisure. So have this done by the time we meet next time. And next I would recommend watching the erythropoiesis and thrombopoiesis, which is going to be red blood cells and platelets. And that will be available in the YouTube channel as well. All right, thanks guys.